The humidity pressed against Private First Class David Mitchell's skin like a wet blanket that refused to dry. It was March 1968, and the 19-year-old from Ohio had been in Vietnam for exactly 47 days. He crouched in the undergrowth near the Cambodian border, his M16 rifle slick with condensation, his ears straining against the darkness that had swallowed the jungle whole. The patrol had stopped moving 20 minutes ago. Sergeant Williams had raised his fist, and 8 men had frozen in place like statues carved from sweat and fear. No one spoke, no one breathed louder than necessary. The jungle around them had gone completely silent. That silence was the first sound that terrified David Mitchell. He had grown up on a farm outside of Columbus where silence meant peace, where the absence of noise signaled the end of a long day's work and the beginning of rest. But here in the triple canopy wilderness of the Central Highlands, silence meant something entirely different. It meant that something had scared every living creature into stillness. It meant that the natural order had been disrupted by a presence that didn't belong. The jungle was never supposed to be quiet. During his first week in country, a veteran corporal named Hendricks had pulled David aside after a patrol briefing. Hendricks had the hollow eyes of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. He smoked cigarettes down to the filter and spoke in short, clipped sentences that wasted no words. "Listen to me, farm boy," Hendricks had said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke into the humid air. "Back home, you learn to be afraid of loud noises, gunshots, explosions, thunder. Your body tenses up when things get loud. That's normal. That's how humans are wired." David had nodded, not understanding where this conversation was heading. "Out here," Hendricks continued, gesturing vaguely toward the tree line beyond their firebase, "you need to rewire yourself. Out here, the silence will kill you faster than any sound. When the jungle goes quiet, that's when you should be scared. That's when Charlie is close." David hadn't fully understood those words until his third patrol, when he experienced his first ambush. The attack had come after 15 minutes of absolute silence, 15 minutes during which every bird had stopped singing, every insect had stopped chirping, every monkey had stopped howling. The jungle had held its breath, and then the world had exploded in muzzle flashes and screaming. 2 men from his squad had died in those first 30 seconds. Now, crouching in the darkness 47 days into his tour, David understood. The silence pressed against his eardrums with physical weight. It was a living thing, that silence. It had texture and temperature. It crawled across his skin and whispered warnings that his conscious mind couldn't quite decipher, but his primitive brain understood perfectly. Somewhere ahead, Sergeant Williams was making hand signals that David couldn't see in the darkness. The patrol began moving again, each man placing his boots with excruciating care, avoiding the dry leaves and brittle twigs that could announce their presence to anyone listening. And someone was always listening. The Viet Cong had mastered the art of jungle warfare over decades of conflict. First against the French, then against the Americans, they had learned to read the forest like a book written in sounds and silences. They knew which bird calls were genuine and which were signals from their comrades. They knew the difference between the rustling of wind through bamboo and the rustling of an American soldier trying to move quietly through the underbrush. David's patrol was hunting for a suspected supply cache near a village that intelligence had flagged as sympathetic to the enemy. It was a routine mission, the kind that happened every night across South Vietnam. But there was nothing routine about the fear that accompanied these operations. Every shadow could hide a rifle barrel. Every vine could be a tripwire. Every step could be the last. The silence continued for another 5 minutes. Then, somewhere to their left, a bird called out. It was a harsh, croaking sound that David didn't recognize. He had grown up around birds, cardinals, and blue jays and mourning doves, but the avian life of Vietnam remained foreign to him, a symphony of unfamiliar voices that he couldn't interpret. Sergeant Williams froze again. The bird called a second time. Then it called a third time, and Williams dropped to one knee, his rifle sweeping toward the sound. The rest of the patrol followed suit. 8 men forming a defensive perimeter in the darkness, their hearts pounding against their ribs, their fingers hovering near triggers. The bird fell silent. Minutes passed. The sweat dripping down David's face attracted mosquitoes that he didn't dare swat away. His legs began to cramp from the awkward position, but he didn't move. Movement meant noise, and noise meant death. Finally, Williams gave the signal to continue. The patrol rose and pressed forward, leaving the mysterious bird call behind them. But the tension remained, coiled in their muscles, etched into their faces. They never found the supply cache that night. They returned to their firebase at dawn, exhausted and rattled. Having spent 8 hours navigating a darkness filled with sounds that might have been natural and might have been human, sounds that might have been harmless and might have been deadly, David Mitchell would spend the next 11 months learning to interpret those sounds. He would learn which animal calls were genuine and which were imitations used by the Viet Cong to communicate across distances. He would learn to distinguish between the silence of a sleeping jungle and the silence of a jungle holding its breath in anticipation of violence. But he would never stop being afraid of the sounds. None of them would. The Vietnam War was many things: a geopolitical struggle, a test of American resolve, a tragedy measured in body counts and broken families. But for the men who fought it on the ground, in the jungles and rice paddies and mountain ranges of Southeast Asia, it was also an acoustic nightmare. It was a war where sound itself became a weapon, where the noises of the natural world were co-opted for military purposes, where silence could signal salvation or doom. The American military had prepared its soldiers for many things. It had trained them to shoot and march and follow orders. It had equipped them with the most sophisticated weapons and technology the world had ever seen. But it had not prepared them for the sounds. No training could prepare a man for the way the jungle spoke. The triple canopy forests of Vietnam were among the most acoustically complex environments on Earth. 3 distinct layers of vegetation, the emergent trees reaching toward the sun, the main canopy forming a green ceiling, and the understory filtering what little light remained, created an echo chamber that distorted and amplified every sound. A snapping twig could seem to come from everywhere at once. A human voice could carry for miles, or be swallowed within yards, depending on conditions that no American soldier fully understood. The wildlife added another layer of auditory chaos. Vietnam was home to hundreds of species of birds, each with its own distinctive call. Monkeys howled and chattered in the canopy. Insects produced a constant background hum that could rise to deafening levels at certain times of day. Frogs and toads added their voices to the chorus after every rainfall. And beneath it all, barely audible but somehow always present, was the sound of water streams trickling through the undergrowth, rain dripping from leaves, humidity condensing on every surface. For American soldiers raised in the relative acoustic simplicity of farms and suburbs and cities, the jungle's soundscape was overwhelming. They couldn't distinguish between the hundreds of different bird calls. They couldn't tell if the rustling in the undergrowth was a snake or a rat or an enemy soldier. They couldn't determine if the splash they heard was a fish jumping or a man crossing a stream. The Viet Cong exploited this acoustic disadvantage with devastating effectiveness. They had grown up in these jungles. They knew every sound, every silence, every subtle variation that indicated a change in conditions. They could move through the forest without making a noise that didn't belong. They could communicate across distances using bird calls and animal sounds that American soldiers couldn't identify as artificial. They could set ambushes in locations where the acoustic properties of the terrain would maximize confusion and minimize warning. And they could use sound as a psychological weapon. In the weeks and months that followed that first patrol, David Mitchell would encounter sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would hear the screams of wounded men echoing through valleys where enemy snipers waited for rescue attempts. He would hear the mechanical clicking of bamboo traps being triggered, followed by the wet sounds of stakes piercing flesh. He would hear the distinctive crack of a K-47 fire, different from the sharper report of American M16s, and learn to judge distance and direction by sound alone. But the sounds that terrified him most were the ones he couldn't explain. There were nights when the jungle seemed to breathe with a voice that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. There were moments when laughter seemed to float through the trees, high-pitched and mocking, impossible to locate. There were times when footsteps seemed to circle the perimeter of their position for hours, never quite close enough to engage, never quite far enough to ignore. These were the sounds that broke men. The American military would eventually develop a term for the psychological toll of jungle warfare: combat fatigue. But that clinical phrase failed to capture the specific horror of acoustic warfare, the way that constant vigilance against sounds could erode a man's sanity more surely than any physical wound. David Mitchell survived his tour. He returned to Ohio in the spring of 1969, physically intact but forever changed. For years afterward, he would wake in the night, certain that he had heard a bird call that didn't belong, a silence that meant danger, a sound that signaled the presence of something that wanted him dead. The jungle's sounds had followed him home. They would follow all of them home. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we uncover the untold stories of soldiers who faced horrors that history books rarely mention: sounds. fears, and moments that shaped the men who survived. Subscribe now so you never miss a story that deserves to be heard. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun had been studying the sounds of Vietnam for 3 years before the war even started. In 1962, while most Americans were still blissfully unaware of the small Southeast Asian country that would come to define their generation, Chun was stationed at a classified listening post in the Philippines, monitoring radio traffic and ambient audio from across the region. He was a linguist by training, fluent in Mandarin, Cantonese, and Vietnamese, with an ear for the subtle variations in tone and inflection that distinguished one dialect from another. But it was the non-linguistic sounds that fascinated him most. Chun had noticed something during his years of monitoring. The Viet Cong communicated in ways that went far beyond radio transmissions and written messages. They had developed an entire vocabulary of natural sounds, animal calls, insect mimicry, environmental signals, that allowed them to coordinate operations across distances without ever saying a word. He had tried to explain this to his superiors, but few had listened. The American military establishment was focused on technological superiority, radar, satellites, electronic surveillance equipment that could intercept enemy communications across continents. The idea that a guerrilla force might be using bird calls to coordinate ambushes seemed almost quaint, a relic of a more primitive era of warfare. Chun knew better. By 1966, he had compiled a classified document cataloging over 200 distinct signals used by Viet Cong forces in the field. Some were simple. A specific pattern of clicks meant enemy approaching, while a descending whistle indicated all clear. Others were more complex, combining multiple sounds to convey detailed information about enemy strength, direction, and equipment. The most sophisticated signals mimicked actual wildlife so perfectly that even trained naturalists had difficulty distinguishing them from the genuine article. Chun had recordings of Viet Cong operatives producing calls that matched native bird species with uncanny accuracy. They had studied the animals of their homeland with the dedication of ornithologists, learning not just the sounds but the patterns when certain birds called, how they responded to disturbances, what their silence indicated. This knowledge gave them an enormous advantage in the acoustic environment of the jungle. When Chun finally deployed to Vietnam in early 1967, he was assigned to a military assistance command, Vietnam intelligence unit tasked with developing countermeasures against enemy communications. His job was to teach American soldiers how to recognize artificial sounds and, when possible, to use the enemy's own acoustic vocabulary against them. It was a task that proved nearly impossible. The average American infantryman arrived in Vietnam with 18 weeks of basic and advanced training. During that time, he learned to fire his weapon, follow orders, navigate terrain, and work as part of a unit. He did not learn to distinguish between the call of a greater racket-tailed drongo and the call of a Viet Cong soldier imitating one. Chun tried to compress his years of acoustic research into briefings that lasted an hour at most. He played recordings of common enemy signals and their natural counterparts. He distributed laminated cards showing spectrograms of sounds that soldiers should report to intelligence. He emphasized again and again the importance of listening, truly listening to the jungle around them. Most soldiers nodded politely and forgot everything he told them within days. It wasn't their fault. The human brain can only process so much information under stress, and the stresses of jungle warfare left little cognitive capacity for acoustic analysis. When a soldier was worried about mines beneath his feet, snipers in the trees, and booby traps in every village, he couldn't spare mental energy for bird identification. But some soldiers learned. Corporal Michael Torres was one of them, a 22-year-old from the Bronx with an intuitive ear for patterns. Torres had spent his childhood navigating the acoustic complexity of New York City, learning to distinguish between different car horns, recognizing the rhythms of various subway lines, identifying neighbors by their footsteps in the hall above. When Chun's briefing covered the rhythmic patterns of enemy signals, something clicked in Torres's mind. "It's like music," Torres said afterward, approaching Chun with a curiosity that set him apart from his fellow soldiers. "They're using rhythm and melody to communicate, just like we do with speech." Chun had nodded, pleased to find someone who understood. "Exactly, and like music, once you learn to hear the patterns, you can't unhear them. You start to recognize when something is wrong, even if you can't immediately identify what." Torres had absorbed everything Chun could teach him. He memorized the timing patterns of the most common enemy signals. He practiced identifying artificial bird calls by their subtle mechanical qualities, the slight imperfections that distinguished a human imitator from the genuine article. He spent hours listening to recordings, training his ear to detect anomalies. Within weeks, Torres had become the unofficial acoustic specialist for his platoon. The other soldiers called him Radar for his uncanny ability to detect sounds that no one else noticed. He had saved lives more than once by recognizing an artificial signal moments before an ambush was sprung, but even Torres had his limits. On a night in August 1967, his platoon was conducting a sweep through a village suspected of harboring Viet Cong sympathizers. The operation had gone smoothly, too smoothly, Torres thought. They had encountered no resistance, found no weapons caches, received no hostile fire. It was the silence that worried him. The village was nestled in a valley surrounded by dense jungle. Under normal circumstances, that jungle should have been alive with sound, birds settling into roosts, nocturnal insects beginning their chorus, monkeys calling to each other as darkness fell. But as Torres's platoon moved through the village, the surrounding forest remained eerily quiet. He had mentioned his concern to Lieutenant Bradshaw, the platoon commander. "The jungle's too quiet, sir," Torres said, keeping his voice low. Something spooked the wildlife. Bradshaw had been in country for only 3 weeks. He was still operating under the illusion that his superior firepower made him invincible. "We probably scared them off ourselves," he said dismissively. "Finish the sweep. I want to be back at base by midnight." Torres had wanted to argue, but military discipline overrode his instincts. He followed orders. The platoon had cleared 2/3 of the village when Torres heard it, a soft, rhythmic clicking that seemed to come from somewhere in the tree line to their north. It was subtle, so subtle that he might have dismissed it as an insect if Chun's training hadn't taught him better. The clicking had a pattern. 3 short, 2 long pause, repeat. It was an enemy signal, one that Chun had specifically warned about. It meant enemy engaged. Prepare to fire. Torres had shouted a warning. He had thrown himself behind a low wall, screaming for his platoon mates to take cover. But his warning came seconds too late. The ambush erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning, and the sound of automatic weapons fire drowned out everything else. Men screamed and fell. Tracers drew glowing lines through the air, and the village that had seemed so peaceful moments ago became a killing ground. Torres had survived. 11 members of his platoon had not. In the aftermath, lying in a field hospital with shrapnel wounds in his legs, Torres had replayed those moments obsessively. He had heard the signal. He had recognized it. But he had been perhaps 3 seconds too late in his warning. 3 seconds that had made the difference between life and death for almost a dozen men. Staff Sergeant Chun had visited him in the hospital. The intelligence officer had aged visibly since Torres last saw him. The lines on his face deepened by the accumulating weight of casualties that his briefings had failed to prevent. "You heard the signal," Chun said. It wasn't a question. Torres nodded. 3 short, 2 long. Engage and fire, and you warned your platoon not fast enough. Chun had sat quietly for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a resignation that Torres had never heard from him before. "You did everything right," Chun said. "You listened. You recognized the pattern. You acted. The problem is that recognition takes time, and time is the one thing we never have enough of in combat." Torres had stared at the ceiling, unwilling to meet Chun's eyes. "Then what's the point?" he asked. "What's the point of learning to hear the signals if we can't respond fast enough?" Chun had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer that he couldn't bring himself to say, that the acoustic advantage would always belong to the enemy, that no amount of training could compress years of cultural knowledge into weeks of instruction, that American soldiers would continue to die because they couldn't read the jungle's language as fluently as their opponents. The technology gap that America relied upon for military superiority was irrelevant in the acoustic domain. Helicopters and jet fighters and artillery were loud, deafening, overwhelming, but the war in the jungle was fought in whispers and silences, in bird calls and insect rhythms, in sounds that no machine could reliably detect or interpret. Chun continued his briefings until the end of his tour. He trained hundreds of soldiers, produced dozens of classified reports, and developed a growing library of enemy acoustic signals. But he knew, with the grim certainty that came from watching casualty numbers climb month after month, that knowledge alone was not enough. The Viet Cong had weaponized the sounds of their homeland, and America had no defense. Specialist 4th Class James Jimmy Kowalski had been in Vietnam for 73 days when he first heard the voices. It was a night like any other, which is to say it was a night saturated with fear. His company had established a night defensive position along a ridge overlooking a valley that intelligence suspected was being used as an infiltration route. They had dug foxholes, set up claymore mines, assigned guards to rotating shifts, and settled in to wait for morning. Jimmy had drawn the second watch, midnight to 2 a.m. He shared his foxhole with Private First Class Dennis Okonkwo, a quiet kid from Georgia who had arrived in country on the same transport as Jimmy. They had become friends in the way that soldiers become friends, bound together by shared misery and mutual dependence rather than any natural affinity. At 0130, Dennis was asleep in the bottom of the foxhole, his helmet covering his face, his breathing slow and regular. Jimmy sat on the firing step, his rifle pointed toward the tree line 30 meters away, his eyes straining against darkness so complete that he couldn't see his own hands. The jungle was alive with sound. Insects chirped and buzzed in an endless cacophony. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out in a haunting, mournful voice. The wind rustled through the leaves overhead, creating a white noise that was almost soothing. Then Jimmy heard something else. It started as a murmur, so faint that he thought he was imagining it, but as he concentrated, the sound grew more distinct. It was a voice, a human voice, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. The voice seemed to come from somewhere in the tree line, or perhaps from the valley below. It rose and fell with an almost musical cadence, as if someone were reading poetry or reciting a prayer. Jimmy's grip tightened on his rifle. His heart began to pound against his ribs. The voice continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded into silence. Jimmy remained frozen, waiting, listening. Had he really heard it? Or had his exhausted mind manufactured sounds from the random noise of the jungle? 5 minutes passed. The insects continued their chorus. Ka. The wind continued to rustle the leaves. Dennis continued to sleep. Jimmy began to relax, convincing himself that he had imagined the whole thing. Then the voice returned. This time it was louder. This time he could make out individual words, not their meaning, because the voice was speaking Vietnamese, but their shape, their rhythm, their human quality. And this time the voice was not alone. A second voice answered the first, then a third, then a fourth. They were all around him. The voices seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing through the darkness, bouncing off trees and rocks and hills in ways that made it impossible to determine their source. Some spoke in low, conversational tones. Others called out in what might have been commands or warnings. At least one voice was laughing, a high, thin sound that made Jimmy's skin crawl. He reached down and shook Dennis awake. Dennis, wake up. Dennis jerked upright, immediately alert. He had learned, like all of them had learned, to transition from sleep to combat readiness in an instant. What is it? He whispered. Listen. They listened together. The voices continued, rising and falling, overlapping and separating, creating a tapestry of human sound that seemed to weave through the jungle like mist. Jesus Christ, Dennis breathed. How many of them are there? Jimmy shook his head. He had no idea. The acoustic distortion of the jungle made it impossible to estimate. There might be 10 of them. There might be 100. They might be a kilometer away. They might be meters from the foxhole. Should we wake the LT? Dennis asked. Before Jimmy could answer, the voices stopped. The jungle fell silent, not the natural silence of animals settling down to sleep, but the sudden absolute silence of a recording that had been switched off. The two soldiers sat in their foxhole, hearts racing, ears straining, fingers on triggers. Minutes passed. The silence continued. Then, just as abruptly as they had stopped, the voices returned. But now they were different. Now they were speaking English. Hey, GI, you're going to die tonight. The words were heavily accented, almost sing-song in their delivery. They came from somewhere to the left, or maybe from everywhere at once. Jimmy couldn't tell. We can see you, GI. We're watching you. You're going to die, and no one's going to help you. Dennis had gone rigid beside him. His breathing had become fast and shallow, the first signs of hyperventilation. Don't listen to them, Jimmy whispered. It's psychological warfare. They're trying to scare us. It's working, Dennis replied. The English voice continued for another minute, promising death in various creative forms, describing what had happened to other American soldiers who had wandered into Viet Cong territory. Then it stopped, replaced by the Vietnamese voices, which resumed their inscrutable conversation as if nothing had happened. The pattern continued throughout the rest of Jimmy's watch. Voices in Vietnamese, then silence, then voices in English, then silence again. By the time his relief arrived at 0200, Jimmy was trembling with exhaustion and fear. He tried to explain what he had heard, but the words came out jumbled, disjointed. His replacement, a sergeant named Murphy who had been in country for 8 months, just nodded. First time you've heard the night voices? Murphy asked. Jimmy nodded. You get used to them, Murphy said, though his own voice suggested that was a lie. They used loudspeakers mounted in the trees, sometimes bullhorns. They've been doing the shit for years. Just ignore them and do your job. How can I ignore them? Murphy didn't answer. He turned toward the tree line where the Vietnamese voices continued their spectral conversation, and Jimmy stumbled back to his sleeping position. He didn't sleep. The night voices, as Murphy had called them, were part of a deliberate psychological warfare campaign that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had refined over years of conflict. They used portable loudspeakers, megaphones, and sometimes just the natural amplification of their own trained voices to project sound into American positions at night. The content varied. Sometimes the voices simply talked, creating the impression of enemy forces massing for an attack that never came. Sometimes they played music traditional Vietnamese songs, or American rock and roll acquired from captured equipment. Sometimes they called out the names of specific soldiers, information gathered from ambush patrols or sympathetic civilians, making their taunts terrifyingly personal. The purpose was always the same: to deprive American soldiers of sleep, to erode their psychological resilience, to make them question their own perceptions and judgment. A soldier who hadn't slept properly in weeks was a soldier who made mistakes. A soldier who couldn't trust his own ears was a soldier who might hesitate at a critical moment. And it worked. Jimmy Kowalski spent the remaining weeks of his deployment in a fog of sleep deprivation and paranoid vigilance. He heard the night voices almost every time his unit established a defensive position. Sometimes they came with attacks. More often they didn't. The unpredictability was part of the torture, never knowing whether the voices were a prelude to violence or simply torment for its own sake. He began to hear voices even when there were none. He would jerk awake from fitful sleep, certain that someone was calling his name, only to find silence. He would pause during daylight patrols, convinced that he had heard Vietnamese being spoken in the trees, only to be told by his squad mates that they had heard nothing. The line between real and imagined sounds began to blur. The jungle itself seemed to be speaking to him, whispering threats and promises that no one else could hear. By the end of his tour, Jimmy Kowalski had been officially diagnosed with what the Army called combat exhaustion. What he called it was simpler. He was losing his mind, one sound at a time. He was not alone. Psychiatric casualties during the Vietnam War would eventually number in the hundreds of thousands. Many of these men would never fully recover, their psyches permanently damaged by experiences that defied easy categorization. The night voices were just one weapon in an arsenal of psychological warfare that the enemy deployed with ruthless effectiveness. But for the soldiers who experienced them, they represented something more profound than military tactics. They represented the fundamental alienation of fighting a war in a place they didn't understand, against an enemy who knew the terrain, both physical and psychological, far better than they ever would. The jungle had its own language, and that language was designed to drive American soldiers mad. If you're feeling the weight of what these soldiers endured, leave a comment saying, "No one should face this alone." Let's honor their memory together. Captain William Bell, Harrington of the 101st Airborne Division, had seen death come in many forms during his 13 months in Vietnam. He had seen men torn apart by artillery, cut down by machine guns, poisoned by punji steaks smeared with human feces. He'd seen death arrive suddenly in ambushes and slowly in field hospitals. He had become intimate with death in ways that his pre-war self could never have imagined. But the death that haunted him most was the silent kind. It happened in November 1969 during Operation Massachusetts Striker, a search and destroy mission in the Ashau Valley. Harrington's company was moving through a stretch of jungle so dense that visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. They were spaced 5 meters apart, close enough to maintain visual contact in the limited visibility, far enough apart that a single burst of automatic weapons fire couldn't take out multiple men. The point man was Sergeant First Class Theodore Teddy Nakamura, a third-generation Japanese-American from California who had been leading patrols in Vietnam for 22 months. Nakamura was the best point man Harrington had ever served, with patient, observant, with an almost supernatural ability to detect danger before it manifested. They had been moving through the jungle for 4 hours when Nakamura raised his hand in the signal to halt. The company froze, weapons ready, eyes scanning the green walls of vegetation that surrounded them. Harrington moved forward carefully, stepping where Nakamura had stepped, avoiding the untouched ground that might conceal booby traps. "What is it?" he whispered when he reached the sergeant's position. Nakamura's face was troubled. He was listening intently, his head tilted slightly to one side. "Something's wrong," he said. "Listen." Harrington listened. He heard the usual sounds of the jungle, birds calling, insects humming, leaves rustling. Nothing seemed out of place. "I don't hear anything unusual," he admitted. "That's the problem," Nakamura replied. "We've been walking for 4 hours. We should have spooked something by now. A monkey, a bird, something. But nothing's moved. Nothing's reacted to our presence." Harrington felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Nakamura was right. In a healthy jungle, the passage of a company of soldiers would create a wave of disturbance, animals fleeing, birds taking flight, the ecosystem responding to an intrusion. But they had moved through this stretch of forest like ghosts, apparently unnoticed by the wildlife around them. "What does it mean?" Harrington asked. "It means the animals already know something's here, something that scared them into hiding before we arrived. They moved forward more cautiously after that, every soldier alert for signs of ambush. But the attack didn't come the way they expected. Private First Class Michael Simmons was sixth in line, walking behind the radio operator, when he simply disappeared. There was no sound, no cry for help, no gunshot. One moment Simmons was there, moving through the undergrowth with his rifle at the ready. The next moment he was gone, as if the jungle had reached out and swallowed him whole. The soldier behind him, Corporal James Washington, saw the disappearance out of the corner of his eye. He called a halt, his voice sharp with alarm. "Simmons, Simmons, where are you?" No answer. The company went to full alert, forming a defensive perimeter, searching for any sign of what had happened. It took them 5 minutes to find Private Simmons. He was hanging from a tree branch by a thin wire noose, his feet dangling 2 feet off the ground. His neck was broken. His death had been almost instantaneous, so fast that he hadn't had time to scream, hadn't had time to warn his comrades, hadn't made a single sound as the trap claimed him. It was a hanging snare, one of dozens of silent booby trap varieties that the Viet Cong had perfected over years of guerrilla warfare. This particular design used a bent sapling as the power source, the trap triggered by a thin tripwire hidden in the undergrowth. When the wire was tripped, the sapling snapped upright with tremendous force, pulling the noose tight around the victim's neck and jerking him off the ground before he could react. The engineering was elegant in its brutality. The design was refined over generations of experience, and the psychological impact was devastating. "Jesus," Washington whispered, staring at the body of his friend. He didn't make a sound. He didn't even make a sound. That was the horror of it, Harrington realized. The silence. In a combat environment where every soldier was trained to listen for danger, where gunshots and explosions were the expected signals of attack, this silent death was uniquely terrifying. You could walk right into it without warning. Your squad mate could die beside you without making a noise. They cut Simmons down and called for a medevac. But the psychological damage was already done. For the rest of that patrol and for many patrols afterward, every soldier in Harrington's company walked with their eyes fixed on the ground, searching for tripwires, terrified of the death that came without a sound. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had developed an entire arsenal of silent weapons. Beyond the hanging snares there were punji pits covered with leaves, their sharpened stakes waiting in darkness for an unwary footstep. There were swinging maces that pivoted silently from tree branches, spiked balls that descended without warning onto heads and shoulders. There were crossbow traps triggered by tripwires, boards studded with nails that could flip up to impale a soldier's legs. All of these weapons shared a common characteristic. They killed or wounded without making a sound that would warn others. The psychological effect was profound. American soldiers had been trained to react to noise, the crack of a rifle, the explosion of a grenade, the distinctive sound of incoming mortar rounds. They had conditioned reflexes that allowed them to seek cover within seconds of hearing gunfire. But no training could prepare them for death that came in silence. The constant vigilance required to avoid silent traps was mentally exhausting. Soldiers had to scan the ground for signs of disturbed earth, watch for glints of wire in the filtered light, test each footstep before committing their weight. This constant attention to the ground drained mental energy that might otherwise have been devoted to watching for human enemies. Men became so focused on avoiding traps that they missed other signs of danger, and the fear spread beyond the jungle patrols. Soldiers began to see tripwires everywhere in the villages and the fire bases, even in their dreams. The silence that had once meant safety now meant potential death. Every quiet moment became an opportunity for anxiety. Every pause in the chaos a reminder that the most dangerous things in Vietnam made no sound at all. Captain Harrington lost 3 more men to silent traps during his remaining months in Vietnam. Each death followed the same terrible pattern, a soldier there one moment, gone the next, claimed by a weapon that announced itself only through the body it left behind. When Harrington finally rotated back to the United States in March 1970, he carried those silences with him. For years afterward, he would freeze at unexpected quiet moments, a lull in conversation, a pause between songs on the radio, the stillness of a winter afternoon. His body had learned to associate silence with death, and that association proved impossible to unlearn. The silent weapons of Vietnam had claimed more than bodies. They had claimed the peace of mind that silence was supposed to bring. Sergeant Major Raymond Ray Patterson retired from the United States Army in 1985. After 26 years of service that included 3 tours in Vietnam, he had earned a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. He had led men into combat, watched friends die, and survived experiences that most Americans couldn't imagine. But in the spring of 1986, 6 months into his retirement, Ray Patterson was sitting in his kitchen in suburban Virginia, unable to move, while a mockingbird sang in the tree outside his window. The bird had been singing for about 10 minutes. It had cycled through its repertoire of borrowed calls: cardinal, blue jay, robin, a car alarm, the beep of a truck backing up. Mockingbirds were remarkable imitators, capable of learning and reproducing hundreds of different sounds throughout their lives. Ray knew all of this. He was a rational man, educated, experienced. He understood that the bird outside his window was just a bird, engaged in the territorial display that was natural to its species. But his body didn't understand. His body was back in Vietnam, frozen in a foxhole, listening to sounds that might be real or might be enemy signals, unable to move because movement meant noise and noise meant death. His wife, Margaret, found him there 2 hours later, still sitting at the kitchen table. His coffee grown cold, his eyes fixed on nothing. She had seen him like this before, though he had always tried to hide these episodes from her. She knew better than to touch him suddenly or speak too loudly. "Ray," she said softly, "Ray, it's okay. You're home. You're safe." It took another 30 minutes for Ray to return fully to the present. By then, the mockingbird had moved on, and the kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. "I'm sorry," Ray said finally, his voice hoarse. I don't know why that still happens, but he did know why. He had spent 3 years in an environment where sounds could kill him, where his survival depended on correctly interpreting every noise, where the wrong response to an acoustic stimulus meant death. His nervous system had been rewired by that experience, conditioned to respond to certain sounds with terror that bypassed all rational thought. The Mockingbird song had included a pattern at 3 short notes followed by 2 long ones that resembled an enemy signal he had heard dozens of times in the jungle. His conscious mind hadn't recognized the similarity, but his amygdala had, and his amygdala had responded the only way it knew how, by flooding his body with adrenaline and cortisol, preparing him for a threat that existed only in memory. Ray Patterson was one of hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans who experienced what would eventually be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. For many of these men, sounds were the primary trigger, not just loud noises like fireworks or car backfires, but subtle acoustic patterns that evoked memories of the jungle. A helicopter passing overhead could transport a veteran back to an extraction under fire. The rustle of wind through leaves could conjure images of enemy soldiers moving through the undergrowth. Even the silence of a quiet room could become threatening, a reminder of those moments before ambushes when the jungle held its breath. The Department of Veterans Affairs would eventually develop treatment programs specifically designed to address sound-related trauma. These programs used gradual exposure therapy, teaching veterans to associate triggering sounds with safety rather than danger. But progress was slow, and many veterans never fully recovered. David Mitchell, the young private whose story opened this account, returned to Ohio in 1969 and tried to resume the life he had left behind. He took over his father's farm, married his high school sweetheart, and had 2 children who grew up never fully understanding why their father sometimes went rigid at unexpected sounds. For 30 years, David avoided talking about his experiences in Vietnam. He didn't attend reunions. He didn't join veterans organizations. He tried to bury the memories under the routine of agricultural work, hoping that enough seasons of planting and harvest would eventually overwrite the jungle's imprint on his mind. It didn't work. In 1998, at the age of 49, David Mitchell finally sought help from a VA counselor who specialized in combat trauma. In their first session, the counselor asked him to describe the specific sounds that triggered his symptoms. David talked for 3 hours. He described the silence before ambushes, the clicking signals of enemy soldiers, the night voices that promised death. He described the screams of wounded men and the mechanical sounds of helicopter rotors. He described bird calls that weren't quite right, and insect choruses that stopped without warning. The jungle talked, he told the counselor. It talked all the time in languages I couldn't understand. And even now, 30 years later, I'm still trying to figure out what it was saying. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., was dedicated on November 13, 1982. The black granite walls, designed by Maya Lin, bear the names of more than 58,000 Americans who died in the conflict. Visitors come from across the country to find the names of fathers, brothers, sons, and friends, to trace the letters with their fingers, to leave flowers and photographs and handwritten notes. The memorial is a place of profound silence. That silence is intentional. Unlike other war memorials with their triumphant statues and stirring inscriptions, the Vietnam Memorial offers only names and reflection. It descends into the earth rather than rising above it, creating a space that feels more like a grave than a celebration. The design acknowledges that the Vietnam War was not a victory to be commemorated, but a wound to be mourned. For many veterans who visit, the silence of the memorial is both healing and difficult. It is a silence free from threat, a silence that means peace rather than danger. But it is also a silence that evokes memories of friends who died in that other, more terrible silence, of moments when the jungle went quiet and death followed. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, the intelligence officer who had spent years cataloging the acoustic signals of the enemy, visited the memorial for the first time in 1995. He found the name of Corporal Michael Torres, the young soldier from the Bronx who had learned to hear patterns in the jungle's sounds on panel 32E. Line 47. Torres had survived the ambush that killed 11 members of his platoon in 1967. He had recovered from his shrapnel wounds and returned to duty, but he had died 2 months later in a firefight along the Cambodian border, shot while trying to reach a wounded soldier who was calling for help. Chun stood before the wall for a long time, his fingers resting on Torres's name. He thought about all the briefings he had given, all the acoustic patterns he had taught, all the soldiers who had nodded politely and then died anyway because knowledge wasn't enough, because the jungle's language was too complex to learn in weeks or months, because the enemy had advantages that no amount of technology could overcome. He thought about the sounds of Vietnam, not the sounds of combat, which were terrible but finite, but the sounds of the land itself, which continued long after the fighting stopped. The birds were still singing in those jungles. The insects were still humming. The rivers were still murmuring their way toward the sea. The acoustic environment that had terrified a generation of American soldiers remained unchanged, indifferent to the human suffering it had witnessed. And he thought about the sounds that the veterans had carried home, the sounds that played in their minds at unexpected moments, that woke them from sleep, that made them freeze in kitchens and parking lots and shopping malls. Those sounds had traveled thousands of miles from their source, embedded in the neural pathways of men who would never fully escape the jungle, even though they had physically left it decades ago. The Vietnam War had ended in 1975, but its acoustic legacy endured. In veterans' hospitals across the country, men still woke screaming from dreams filled with sounds that no one else could hear. In therapy sessions, they still described the clicking signals and the night voices and the silence that preceded death. In quiet moments with their families, they still went rigid at bird songs and rustling leaves and the absence of noise that reminded them of ambushes. The jungle had spoken to them in a language they hadn't been able to understand, and even now, decades later, they were still listening. Captain William Harrington, who had watched Private Simmons die in a silent trap, became an advocate for veterans' mental health services after his retirement. He testified before Congress about the long-term psychological effects of combat, arguing that the invisible wounds were often more debilitating than the visible ones. "We trained these men to listen," he told the subcommittee in 1991. "We told them that their lives depended on hearing the enemy before the enemy heard them. We put them in an environment where every sound could mean death, where silence was as dangerous as gunfire. And then we brought them home and expected them to live normal lives, as if they could just turn off the vigilance that had kept them alive." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The sounds of Vietnam never stopped for these men. They're still hearing them 40 years later. They'll probably hear them until the day they die. And if we don't provide them with the help they need, those sounds will kill them through suicide, through substance abuse, through the slow erosion of untreated psychological trauma. The war may be over, but for many veterans, the battle continues. The subcommittee eventually increased funding for VA mental health programs, but Harrington knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The sounds of Vietnam had penetrated too deeply, had altered too many minds, had left too permanent an imprint on the men who had heard them. Some wounds heal. Others become part of you, woven into the fabric of your being, shaping who you are for the rest of your life. The sounds of the Vietnam jungle were that kind of wound, 50 years after the last American combat troops left Vietnam, the lessons of that acoustic nightmare remain relevant. Modern soldiers fighting in different jungles, different deserts, different urban environments continue to experience the psychological toll of auditory stress. The specific sounds have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you train a human being to survive in an environment where every noise could signal death, and then expect that human being to return to normal life when the fighting is over? The answer, as Vietnam taught us, is that you cannot. The sounds of war become part of the soldier, carried home in neural pathways that are not easily rewired. They echo through years and decades, triggered by innocent stimuli, conjuring memories that retain their power long after the events themselves have faded into history. David Mitchell passed away in 2019 at the age of 70. His family said he had found peace in his final years, thanks to therapy and medication and the support of fellow veterans who understood what he had experienced. But they also said that he never stopped listening, even at the very end. His granddaughter, who had sat with him in his final hours, reported that his last words were a warning. "The jungle's too quiet," he whispered. "Something's coming." Then he closed his eyes, and the sounds of Vietnam finally fell silent. The jungle sounds of Vietnam did more than terrify American soldiers. They transformed them, rewiring their brains, reshaping their relationship with the acoustic world they had known since birth. Those sounds became a permanent part of who they were, a shadow that followed them home and never fully departed. This is the legacy that history often forgets, not just the battles and the body counts, but the sensory experiences that made the war real for those who fought it. The sounds that kept them alive in combat became the sounds that haunted them in peace. The vigilance that saved them in the jungle became the hypervigilance that tormented them at home. They listened because their lives depended on it. They continue to listen because they cannot stop. And somewhere in the jungles of Vietnam, the birds are still singing, the insects are still humming, and the forest is still speaking in languages that we were never meant to understand. If you watched this far, it's because this story truly reached you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These soldiers' experiences deserve to be remembered. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories of courage, fear, and humanity that we bring every week. Until next time.